All right, in this unit we're going to turn to the first of our 7 isms for the course, idealism. The reason we're doing idealism first is that it's the most ancient of the philosophical systems, historically speaking. Humans were religious for a long time before philosophy was developed, and I think it's fair to say that the first systems of philosophies were systematizations of religious thinking, but rather than accepting the stories of the religion on faith or as a matter of tradition, the first philosophers in the idealist tradition were more concerned with making arguments for and systematizing those stories. Now, idealism as a system goes back to the Greeks. The first great idealist philosopher is Plato, and there's a long line of idealist thinking spawned by Plato, many variations obviously on idealist thinking. But what they all have in common is an affinity for a religious way of thinking about the world. Whether they're explicitly religious or not, and however many ways in which they disagree with religion, most idealist thinkers will hold that the essentially religious way of thinking about the universe and our place in it is the right way to think about it. Now, idealism is, in this context, a metaphysical label. We sometimes talk about people being idealist ethically or politically, having a set of values that they are committed to. In this case, what we mean is that the stuff of the world is essentially the stuff of ideas and the kinds of beings that have ideas. That is to say, we're giving mind priority over matter, or the spiritual world, if we think of the world as populated by a grand spirit or several spirits who have minds. That is what we are giving priority in our metaphysical system, hence the label idealism. If we think, for example, of most traditional religions, particularly the Western religions, where we have a personalized divinity, God is conceived of as a giant mind or a great mind or an all-encompassing mind. And his mind has ideas, it has thoughts, it has plans, it has designs. And so we understand the world in terms of God's idea, right, for the world pre-existing it, and the universe and all of creation is an expression of that idea, hence idealism. Now, I want first to put idealism's major theses, the generic ones up in terms of the philosophical categories of metaphysics, human nature, epistemology, and ethics, and where necessary indicating major subspecies or major divides within the idealist tradition. But I want, for the most part, to stay as generic as possible in this long and complicated tradition. Metaphysically, I think the best way to say idealism's core theses is to capture it as a thoroughgoing dualism, that the best way to understand, the truest way to understand the universe and everything that exists is in terms of a divide between a lower realm, what we will call the natural realm. So there is the realm of nature, and then above, beyond, superior to, we have the realm of supernature. And in this dualism, there's a fairly systematic opposition between the two realms in terms of their various features. So we can say, for example, that the supernatural world is a spiritual world, right? Completely non-physical. The natural world, by contrast, is non-spiritual. It is, say, purely material or purely physical. The supernatural world is a realm of perfection, whereas by contrast, the natural world is imperfect or it's subject to various sorts of corruptions. The supernatural world is an eternal world. It's not subject to time considerations, say, or change. Why would it if it's already perfect? And so we can say, in some sense, those temporal change concepts don't apply to it. Whatever is true of it is true for all time. By contrast, the world of nature is a world of change. It may be a world of process. So we can say up here, for example, that this is a world of absolutes, whereas down here we have things that are in process. They are the way they are for a certain amount of time, but even in that time, they're on the way to being whatever it is that they are next. Everything in the natural world is particular. By contrast, things in the supernatural world are more general. Down here we have a realm of, say, concretes in all of their traits. Up here, the perfect world is much more abstract and so on. So we have a fairly systematic then opposition between all of the features of the natural world, all of the features of the supernatural world. The supernatural world has a value component typically attached to it. It's the higher world, it's the better world. So we can add that here. This world is, by contrast, the lower world. And in many cases, there's a tension or an opposition between how things work in the natural world and where the natural world tends to go of its own right, by contrast, where the supernatural world goes and where it wants to go of its own right. Okay. That's a dualism on a cosmic scale, metaphysically speaking. I want next to talk about human nature from an idealist perspective. And as with most philosophies, the human being is seen as a microcosm of the macrocosm, the broader world here. And so what we will find in the case of a human being is a distinction within our nature. We ourselves are dualists. And so from our earlier discussion of dualism, almost all idealists are fairly thoroughgoing dualists in their view of human nature. So what we'll have up here is we'll have our soul, and then down below we'll have our body, or we might think of ourselves as having a spirit. Our body, by contrast, is purely physical. Up here we will have our mind, including in many cases, say, our capacity for reason, that being the thing that distinguishes us from the other animal species that are merely physical bodies, on various sorts. And down below here we will have our senses, which we do share with the other animals, but our senses are embodied physical traits and so forth. Now again, just as there is a difference of destiny, approach, goals, and so forth, metaphysically at the higher level, in looking at human nature, most, but again not all, but most advocates of idealism will hold that there is a conflict between these two aspects of our human nature. Naturally, our bodies have certain desires, certain drives for food, sex, drink, materialistic sorts of things. By contrast, our souls and spirits have at least the capacity with them for a higher destiny. If properly trained or if properly constituted, they're not interested in bodily things. Instead, their ultimate destiny and an ultimate yearning is to reunite with and come to know and commune with the higher world as well. So at any given point, the human being is torn by a conflict. Our body always has its desires and its appetites, and at the same time our soul has its desires and its appetites, but you can't serve two masters at any given time, and so one has a conflict. Am I going to satisfy a bodily urge, or am I going to satisfy a spiritual urge in this particular case? There's almost always a value judgment association with here. We can add that the soul is, of course, the higher element within us. It's that which we share in kinship with the higher realm metaphysically, and our body is the lower part of ourselves as well. And when we turn to the ethics of idealism, there are strong implications important here. But before we do that, I want to turn next to epistemological issues and raise the question of knowledge for idealists. As human beings, we want to know the world, and we want to know the reality, and certainly want to come to know the important truths about reality. And so then there's a question how, if we say the lower realm, the natural world, is of less importance and less significance, less interest to us, we really want to focus our attention on and come to know the higher reality, the source of all of the important truths, the eternal truths are in the higher reality. How do we come to do so? Well, here the story requires a little bit of a distinction between different kinds of idealists. There are some idealists, for example, who are very strongly religious in their orientation, and are traditionally religious in their orientation, and they will then, in talking about the supernatural, speak of it in terms of a personalized being. Right, and so we can then say our question epistemologically is how can we as human beings come to know God, right, or come to be reunited with God? And the standard answer here is that God, being a purely spiritual being, is not going to be something that we can understand through the senses. The senses are physical organs. All they can do is come to know the natural world. We're not going to come to know God through studying nature because God is wholly other, completely different than. And so what we're then going to need is to have something that we do with our soul, spirits, right, or minds that come to know God. Now, most religions have, at best, put reason a co-equal as a capacity here. Most religions will give pride of place to saying that God is not something that we can primarily reason about. Rather, we need to have a soul connection, right, or a spiritual connection. Perhaps a revelatory connection is a possibility here. So I will start a subcategory here. If we are religious in our idealism, one possible answer is to say that what we need to do is to train our souls or our spirits to have various sorts of mystical capacities. And it's when one is having a mystical experience that one is having a direct connection cognitively between your soul and the great soul that is God. If one is not one of the people who either by nature is capable of having mystical experiences, some religions will argue that way, or if one has not sufficiently trained oneself, then one will have to rely on those who have had mystical experiences. And so we will have an emphasis on faith as the proper epistemology. For those of us who are more naturalistic in our orientation, coming to know that the higher world is going to be simply a matter of faith. And in some religious traditions, typically later religious traditions, partly due to the influence of philosophy, there will be a secondary role that will be assigned to reason. Reason might take one a certain way along the path toward coming to know God, and then the final step will be a mystical step or a faith-oriented step. Or it might be the case that after one has accepted a certain religious tradition, perhaps on faith, the job of reason secondarily is to come along and provide supporting rationality, supporting reasons for one's faith in this particular case. Non-religious idealists will, when they're conceiving of the supernatural world, conceive of it in impersonal terms. Right? They'll say there is a higher eternal world of absolutes, but it's not a being that has thoughts or goals or feelings or particularly cares. Instead, it's a set of higher realities that set the standard for and perhaps generate the lower world of nature and inform it to some extent. Instead of then thinking of the world in terms of God or the gods, right, or various sorts of spirits who have personalities, here we will speak in terms of the higher world being, or in some world, the kind of world of forms, right, or the world of ideas, right, and so on. Or we might say ultimate reality, right, using capital U and capital R in those particular cases. Now, the epistemological story, that is to say, the question of how we come to know this higher world, tends to be different for those idealists who are more impersonal in their conception of the supernatural realm. Typically, what you find in impersonal idealists is a de-emphasis on faith, a de-emphasis on of just following tradition, and a de-emphasis on revelatory techniques, excuse me. Because if God does, or if the higher realm is not a God, then God is not particularly interested in communicating with you, so he's not going to single you or anybody out for revelations as the God of the Old Testament did. Instead, it's more likely to be the case that it will be us as human beings who will have to exert certain sorts of efforts if we're going to come to understand and perhaps tap into the higher realm. Now, what the epistemology then that it was going to be emphasized by the impersonal advocates of idealism is what I will call a pure reason, right, approach. Right? And that will be a reason, that is to say, we will in principle be able to reason our way from our starting place in the natural world up to the supernatural world. And here the argument is going to be that in addition to our human nature, including sensory apparatus that put us in contact with the natural world, we also have reason, right? Or we have a mind, and the primary purpose of our mind is not to come to know the natural physical world, but rather it has a different destiny, a higher destiny. Our job as human beings, using our exalted rational capacity, is to use it to come to understand and comprehend the higher, pure physical world, or sorry, supernatural, the non-physical world. Now let me give you an example of this. Suppose we look at a drawing I will do over here. And suppose you're a 2-year-old child, and I ask you, Susie, what do you see here? And you will say, of course, that you see a horse. And so you learn the word horsey. And we might look at a number of other horses. So I'll draw them as well. My years of art school training are paying off here. And there's another one. Okay. And then by contrast, say, there's another little animal here that is much smaller and it's got pointy ears. Okay. And I say, what's that, Susie? You said, that's horse. What's this? Well, that's also horse. What's this, Susie? That's also horse. And you say, what's that? Well, that's not horse. That's dog. Right? And so this, Susie can then see the difference between the dog and the horses, and we put all of those in one category, and then we come to understand horse. So we have a slightly more abstract concept here of horse, and we've distinguished that from the concept of dog, and also using our senses, we can see the differences between the horses and the dogs in this case. All right, suppose then we are carrying on teaching Susie her word lessons, trying to expand her vocabulary and understanding of the world. So we go for a walk in the woods, and we look at some of these objects. Right? And we say, what is that, Susie? And she says, well, that's a tree, right? And so we taught her the concept of tree, some kind of conifer there. And we draw some more here. So we look at that one. There's another tree. And there's another tree, and so forth. And then there might be, but say by contrast, some little tiny thing down the bottom, that we're looking at as we're walking along here. And we say that's a flower of some sort or other. So we put all of these in a category, and Susie assigns the abstract word designator word tree for that. And so now she knows tree, she knows flower, she knows dog, she knows horse, right, and so forth. Okay, then we ask Susie to perform a bigger abstraction. So far we're using our senses, and we're doing a little bit of rational categorization as well. We say, all right, Susie, what does this have in common with this? Suppose we now have these on a board, as I have, or in a picture here. What do they have in common? What are they both? And maybe we'll even give her one other set of categories over here. Suppose I draw some shapes on the board here, just some asterisks, and I say, what are all of those things? Well, those are asterisks, say, in contrast to this, which is just a square. But then I say, Susie, this, and this, what do those all have in common? And then we might draw her attention to 1, 2, 3, right? 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. We're trying to teach her some numerical concepts. Then at a certain point she says, oh, that's 3 trees, that's 3 horses, that's 3 asterisks. These are all 3. Okay, good. Now what have we done here? Well, we have now introduced a new abstract symbol, right? This stands for anything, right, that has 3-ness. It can stand for this, it can stand for this, it can stand for this in an open-ended kind of way, even though asterisks, horses, and trees are all very different in all of their particular dimensions. Nonetheless, they share something abstract in common. They share 3-ness, right, with each other. Okay, Susie is now 5 years old. Suppose we have got basic numbers under our belt and we want Susie to start doing more difficult things. So we have done this with Susie. We've got 3, and now I'm adding this to, count them with me, Susie, 1, 2, 3, 4. I've done 4, right, more stars. So I had 3 stars. I added 4 stars. I use that symbol for that. So 3, 4. How many stars do we have altogether here, Susie? And then Susie at a certain point learns, that's 7. Now what we have now here is a completely abstract formula. Right? This is an abstraction, this is an abstract operator, this is an abstraction, this is an abstract operator, this is another numerical abstraction, and Susie gets it. And then at a certain point, she should be able, for example, even without counting on her fingers, even without having diagrams, be able to take abstract numerical concepts and manipulate them in her reason. And then at a certain point, Susie now gets into to middle school, and we're asking Susie to do things like, well, suppose you have 5, Susie, and you want to get 12, right? You need to add how much? And so we'll put an x in there. So 5 plus x equals 12. Solve for x, please, Susie. But now notice what we've introduced here. We've introduced an x, which is a variable, and then a variable in this context is an abstraction on any number, right? It can stand for any number, right, whatsoever. And after we get Susie comfortable with doing these sorts of things, she probably now wants to be called Susan rather than Susie. We then are going to start teaching her things like x squared plus y squared equals z squared. Right? We might teach her the Pythagorean theorem, right, for example, and teach her this formula here. But what do we have up here? We don't have any digits at all. Instead, it's entirely variables plus exponents, and we want her to be able to do that sort of thing in a manipulative fashion. Now let me grab another color here and just point out why, from the idealist perspective, this is a beautiful thing. What we are doing in this case here is starting when Susie is very young cognitively at the level of concretes, right, at the level of particulars, at the level of things that are physical, right? Dogs, trees, horses, and so forth. And then what we're doing with Susie is taking her up the chain of being to a realm that is now abstract, purely mental, right, when we are doing these operations, right, in our head, and completely general, right, or generic. At this level of Susie's cognitive operation, she is primarily using her senses. She is a sensorially driven being. At this point, she is now a mature thinker, a human thinker. She's using reason and a pure reason. And it's a pure reason because on the idealist account, by the time you start doing higher order mathematics like this, you don't need the sensory inputs anymore. You can purify your thought from any sort of physicalistic understanding and consider the mathematical truths for what they are in their own rights. Also, what's true is these things come and go, right? The horses and the trees, right, and so forth, but 3 plus 4 remains the same. So those particular things in nature are all subject to change. Nonetheless, the higher truth, 3 plus 4 equals 7, that's eternally true. The Pythagorean theorem was true back when Pythagoras discovered it. It was true before he discovered it, according to the idealists. It still is true, and it will always be true in its exact perfect formulation as handed down through all of time. So what we then have is, from this idealistic approach, an emphasis on reason as our means of coming to know the higher world, but it's a reason that's purified of sensory input. Sensory input is a lower form of coming to understand reality, and at best it can only put us in touch with a lower world. So as soon as possible, cognitively, what we want to do is leave the sensory input behind and rise to the realm of pure reason. Now, another point that's important in connecting human nature to epistemology human nature to epistemology for the idealists is the question of how many people are capable of, say, achieving mystical insights. How many people are capable of engaging in the pure reason that is really necessary in order to come to understand the higher truths. What most idealists will argue is that in this divide in human nature, it is unfortunately this side of our identity that is the strongest part of our identity. That is to say, our physicality dominates us while we are part of the natural world. And then by contrast, our minds are weak, or our souls are weak, or our spirits are weak. And so in this ongoing conflict between mind and body, it is almost always the body that prevails for most people, right, most of the time. Now, of course, there are varying degrees, right, among idealists to what extent that they sign on to this dichotomy between the weak mind or the weak spirit, weak soul, and strong body. So I want to give you a couple of quotations to indicate the range of opinion here. All right, so I've got a quotation or two I want to run by you in order to speak of this issue of the difference between our assessment of the strengths and capacities of the soul versus the body in the idealist tradition. Some idealists, a large number of them, particularly in many of the Western religious traditions, have argued that by nature, while all human beings do have a soul or a spirit, it is naturally subject to overpowering influences from the bodily and physical side of us. In many cases, that's put in moralistic language. The argument is that we know that our soul should be aspiring to higher metaphysical truth, but at the same time, our body is providing various strong temptations, but because we are weak morally, we give in to our bodily temptations, and so therefore we are fundamentally sinners, right? We do things that we know we shouldn't be doing. Others will take that same position and strengthen it, arguing that we really just can't help ourselves. To be a human being is to be dominated by the physical side of our natures, and our spiritual side or our mental side is totally incapacitated. And so that is why we are totally weak, totally dependent upon a higher power to come in and rescue our souls from being trapped in this lower body and in the lower physical world. As a representative of that tradition, kind of that extreme body strong, soul weak position, I have a quotation from St. Paul from the New Testament, where St. Paul says, quote, "I am physical, sold into slavery to sin. I do not understand what I am doing, for I do not do what I want to do. I do the things that I hate. What a wretched man I am. Who can save me from this doomed body?" All right, so what he is saying is what he really wants to do is to have his soul reunited with God, but he finds himself completely incapable of doing those sorts of things. He always finds himself doing the things that he doesn't want to do. That is to say, he being his soul in this case, what he does is he does what his body does, right? He is sold into slavery, right, to sin. Sin in this case being doing the things that the body wants, which are the opposite of the things that God wants for him. And so he then ends with the pleading question, who can save me from this doomed body? And the implication is, since he can't do it, only God is going to be able to come along and save him. Now that is, I think that defines one end of the spectrum. Other idealists are not so pessimistic about the human capacity to come to achieve some higher understanding, to distance himself from things physical. And I'll use Plato as an example here. Plato, the great Greek philosopher of 2,500 years ago. Now Plato argues that by nature only a few people have the capacity to use their souls, spirits, and their minds to get away from the impulses of the body. He has rather a tripartite division of humanity into those who are, for the most part, sold out to their physical being by nature. They don't have a strong enough spirit or a strong enough mind, and so they are essentially only a little bit higher than most of the brute animals that are out there. But there are, in Plato's account, some human beings who, through usually an accident of birth, or it's not to say that they chose to be this way, although choice does become an element in his system, but that they are born, right, with a mind that is strong enough, that with effort, with diligence, with resolution, their mind can come to control and tame their bodily impulses, and so through the application then of pure reason come to ascend to a higher plane of abstraction and understanding in the higher world. And many idealists, usually it's idealists in the more impersonal position, will follow Plato down that road of urging those few among us who have such a capacity not to waste that capacity, not to give in to the bodily and physical naturalistic way of life, but rather to strengthen their mind, strengthen their spirit, and achieve higher truth. Okay, I want to do one little exercise just to illustrate the idealist way of thinking on all of these points here. And for that, let me erase the board. All right, so here's a little exercise in idealistic thinking. Let me start off by giving you a trick question. I'll give you that warning. It's a trick question. We'll see how much of an idealist you are right off the bat. Here we go. Okay. The question is, what is that? Got your answer? Okay. Did you say triangle? If so, wrong. That's not a triangle. Not from the idealist way of thinking about it. It might look like a triangle. You might have been conditioned by your upbringing and your current state of cognitive development to think of this as a triangle, but this is not a triangle. Why not? All right, well, what is a triangle? All right, we are philosopher, mathematicians of an idealistic sort. What is a triangle? Let's wrap our minds around first clearly the concept of being a triangle. So for that, I will put on the board, there's our word, triangle, and we want to get very clear and see if we can come up with a definition of what a triangle is. Okay, and I will offer this definition. We can quibble over it if necessary, but I think it's a pretty good one. We would say something like the following. A triangle is an enclosed, three-sided figure with interior angles that add up to 180 degrees. Fair enough? And that captures, I think, the central insight that most of us have about what a triangle is. An enclosed three-sided figure with interior angles that add up to 180 degrees. Okay, so what we now have then is an abstract general formulation that hopefully will fit all of the triangles, right, that are true of the world. Now we take this abstract formulation and then we look at this particular thing over here that I've drawn on the board and we say, well, does this fit the definition? If it fits the definition, then certainly it's a triangle, but if it doesn't fit the definition, then it can't be a triangle. And so the first thing we would have to say is, well, first thing is this word enclosed, right? It has to be an enclosed, right, three-sided figure. And this is where I was a little bit sneaky, why I said this was a trick question. In fact, as it happens, this is not enclosed. If you look closely here, there's a bit of a gap. Right? Aha, that's not just philosophy trickery, right? That's an important truth. In many cases, in the lower natural world, when we're talking about triangles, right, we'll use the term more loosely. In this case, it's not actually an enclosed, it's pretty close to being enclosed, but it's not in fact enclosed, so it doesn't meet the definition here. We might say that the three sides in a triangle are supposed to be straight lines. I might have incorporated that into the definition, in which case certainly this line over here is suspect, and this bottom line, well, that's just horrible, whoever drew that. That's not even straight at all, so that's not really a triangle at all. What about the latter part of the phrase here, interior angles that add up to 180 degrees? I would bet a great deal of money if we were to take a protractor, put it on the board, measure these three angles here, add them up. It wouldn't come out to 180 degrees. It might come out to 178 degrees, 184 degrees, who knows, but it's not going to be 180 degrees. Even if I had a crude protractor and it came out to 180 degrees, I could come back and say, well, with a more precise protractor, there are going to be minor differences or minor offset angles here that are not going to allow it to add up to 180 degrees. So what we then have to say as idealists is, this isn't really a triangle. We might say that it's a kind of, sort of, in the area, so to speak, triangle. But it's not really a triangle. A triangle is only that which meets this definition. And then, of course, we can ask the follow-up question, if this is not a triangle, and if we had really fine-grained protractors and measured all the triangles that exist in the world, are there any triangles in the world? And the strict idealist is going to say, no, there are no triangles in the world. What we have in the world are things that are corrupt, things that are constantly in a process of change, right? This is expanding and contracting as the temperatures change in a very slight direction here. The only place where we find actual triangles, that is to say things that meet this definition, are going to be in a higher world, right? And the reason why the Pythagorean theorem is true now, just as it was true 2,500 years ago, and will be true 2,500 years from now, is that the triangularity, that abstract, completely general, straight, exists in a higher realm of eternal, perfect essences, right, and so to speak. And by contrast, if I take my eraser, this triangle here did exist, or whatever it was, I mistakenly called it a triangle, doesn't exist anymore. It's subject to a process of change and corruption. It comes into existence and comes out of existence, but triangularity never changes, right? What it is to be a triangle is eternal, and it is perfect. All right, that's an exercise in thinking metaphysically and epistemologically rather, as an idealist. I now want to turn to the ethics of idealism. Let me get my black marker again here. All of this has value implications, and the ethics, in the case of idealism, falls out of the metaphysics, the epistemology, and the human nature. It's a derivative branch in this particular case here. If it is the case that here we are as human beings with one foot, so to speak, in the physical world and one foot, so to speak, in the higher spiritual world, the human being being a microcosm of this, what we really want is, where the real good, where the real truth, where the ultimate reality is, or at least what we should want, is to get as much of ourselves up into the higher, more perfect eternal world as it is possible for us to do so. That will require a certain amount of dealing with the whole of our human nature in appropriate ways, and certainly it is going to have a cognitive component. How can we use our minds or our souls or spirits appropriately to put us on the path to being reunited with the higher world, or at least coming to understand the higher world. And that's why when we turn to the ethics, the ethical systems that are developed within the idealist tradition typically have a dual component to them. That we have one aspect of our ethical system directed toward how we should handle our body, how we should handle the physical side of our being, and another part directed toward how we should handle the soul, mind, or spirited side of our being. Now, the dealing with the physical side of our being, I'm going to call that the negative side of ethics. And it's negative because usually it involves attacking something or dealing with something that is either in itself negative or at the least a lower right order of being. The one thing that we first have to do, and an important part of ethics training right from the very beginning, is getting people to tame their bodies, to control their bodies, to discipline their bodies right in various ways. The fear being that human nature, the bodily being strong, if we don't exert great efforts when we're parents teaching children or when we become able to ourselves, then the bodily side of our nature is just going to run wild and swamp the whole of our human condition, and that's a bad thing. So what we need to do is focus on controlling the body. Right, and that's the first order of business. And so what we need here is a great deal of discipline. We need to exert self-control. And self-control in this context here usually involves a certain amount of denial. Right? Our bodily appetites are constantly pressing for stimulation. Right? We want pleasure, we want food, we want drink, and it's very easy for those things to get out of hand. And so what we then will want to do is put various kinds of limitations on the satisfaction of various bodily desires here. Now this is something that is generic to all human beings, but most idealists don't think that human beings can, most of them, do this very much. Human beings have to inescapably, given their nature, give in to their desires for food, drink, sexuality, and so forth. But we simply want to have our ethics be a restraining device or a harnessing device, and so forth. For the better among us, the stronger among us, those of us who have more potential from the idealist perspective, the degree to which we go down the road of denial and limitation can be very extreme, and we might go as far as embracing entirely the ascetic virtues here. So, for example, if we are concerned with maximal soul development, we might try to get ourselves to the point where we are totally in denial of our body. For example, sex tends to occupy a great deal of our mental space and time, and so one way to totally shut down that part of one's body so as to free up one's mental space and time for other things is to take a vow of celibacy, and that then is to totally shut down one part of one's being. Another practice that one can engage in is fasting. That is to say, go for as long as one can without eating, learning to control one's appetite, to get oneself to the point where your bodily need for food and thirst seems to shut down, and so that then frees you up as well. All right, another practice that one can do has typically a more cognitive component. One might engage in practices of meditation, and certainly Eastern idealist traditions are famed for their meditative practices. Western religious traditions and idealist traditions also engage in them, though in my judgment not as strictly and as extremely as some of the Eastern traditions here. And meditation can have a twofold aspect here, but I want to focus just on one aspect of meditation here, and that can be the practice of shutting down one's body, not just one's appetites and so forth, but also shutting down one's senses, removing all sorts of sensory stimulus. The idea here being if we can shut down our eyes, so we're not constantly being bombarded with visual stimuli, shut down our ears, and so forth, remain motionless so that our bodies are no longer sensitive to their environments. And that's why people in practicing meditation will go into dark, quiet places and so forth. The idea then is shutting down one's senses will thereby free up one's mind, and then one's mind can presumably go on and engage in the higher spiritual exercises that one wants to do so. Now, supposing to whatever degree one succeeds in the negative aspect of the idealist tradition, this is not an end in itself. The major part of idealist ethics is to achieve the good, and for that we need a positive program. And so, suppose you have achieved physical self-discipline, You are no longer a slave to your bodily appetites. You have freed your mind, you have freed mental space, you have freed your soul. What does one then do, right, with one's psychological side in order to achieve, right, the higher knowledge or the higher union and communion with that realm? Well, again, there's a great variety of positions that are possible among idealists. The more religious ones will argue that one doesn't do anything. It's not the case that human beings are the achievers in this case. Instead, the purpose of all of this negative is to simply prepare oneself for God to act upon one if God so chooses. And so one might simply adopt a pose of waiting for grace, right, to occur, right, to one. Or one might argue that by undergoing the various disciplinary procedures here, one can receive various sorts of revelations or personal communications from God, presuming that one's soul has been actively prepared in the right kind of direction. Other people in religious traditions will argue that we don't have to be entirely passive and simply wait for God to do all of the work. There are some things that we can do to move ourselves, right, toward God or toward the higher spiritual world. We can, for example, engage in actions of prayer. And prayer certainly is not simply passive. Instead, one is directly trying to communicate to God, trying to beseech God, and in fact try to will oneself to move in a more God-like direction. One might engage in practices such as reading Scripture, the idea being that by reading Scripture, one is getting one's mind, one's soul, one's spirit right into God's Word, into a spiritual place, and with that, under certain circumstances, will come inspiration, right? The Spirit will move, right, within one, and it will move one in a direction that is more godly. On the idealist, impersonal side, those who don't believe in the particularly religious formulations that we have here, the positive actions that one will engage in typically are of a more intellectual nature. If, for example, we believe that mathematics is a beautiful thing, as many idealists do. I mean, lots of people believe that, but idealists of the impersonal sort particularly love mathematics because it's in mathematics that you find truths that seem to be most absolute, most eternal, most perfect, and they certainly are very abstract in general. So the idea here might then be that what one can do is devote oneself to a lifelong study of mathematics, pure mathematics, higher mathematics, abstract mathematics. The idea being that the more abstract one gets, the more one is approaching and understanding and communing with the fundamental structure of the universe or the guiding abstract principles of the universe, and so forth. And so we might then engage in math and various other sorts of intellectual pursuits that are of a higher order, a purely abstract order, and leave anything to do with physicality behind as much as possible in our lives. All right, that is a quick sketch of some of the major generic themes in idealism, with a few partings of the way into subspecies of idealism as they developed over the course of the history of philosophy. What I want to do next is turn to two actual idealists, Plato in the ancient world, Kant in the modern world, and spend a little time reading actual writings of Plato and some actual writings of Kant to get a sense for what idealists will say in their own right. All right, I want to turn now to Plato and use Plato as a representative of one of the great traditions in idealistic philosophy. Everyone has heard the name Plato, whether they have read him or not. And he is certainly well worth reading, having influenced generations of philosophy, and his impact is still with us in the 21st century. Plato was the student of Socrates and was in turn the teacher of Aristotle. We'll learn a little bit more about Aristotle when we turn to realism next time, tradition in many cases opposed to the idealist one. But in this case, what I want to do is turn to an excerpt from Plato's Republic. The Republic is Plato's perhaps best known work. It certainly is considered his magnum opus, in which he lays out all of his philosophy systematically, including many applications to political philosophy and educational philosophy. The Republic is one of these great sprawling works. The book as a whole is divided into 10 sub-books, and in those books Plato works through his metaphysics, his view of human nature, his epistemological theory, and his ethics. But he's also concerned with, as the title of the work suggests, the Republic, with political philosophy, and a major part of the exercise in the Republic is to construct what Plato thinks an ideal political state would look like. And having done all of those issues, talked about philosophy, the right kind of underlying philosophy for the right kind of political system, Plato also is then concerned with educational issues. How do we educate people, particularly young people, so that they grow up to be the kinds of people who can be citizens in the best kind of state? So the section I'm going to read to you is a dialogue. Actually, the whole of the work is a dialogue between Socrates, a character Plato is using based on the historical Socrates, but it's probably not Socrates' actual words in this case here. Socrates engaging in an extended conversation with a number of individuals over the course of the 10 books. In this point here, we're in book 7, and Socrates is having a conversation with Glaucon, a younger admirer of Socrates, and Socrates has explained to him his metaphysical system and its epistemology and the views of human nature, right, and so forth. And Socrates is noticing that Glaucon seems to be following some of it, but does not seem to have grasped it in as much detail as Socrates would like. So Socrates then proceeds to tell an allegory, right? It's what usually known as the allegory of the cave or the myth of the den or some such variation. So let's read a little bit here in the myth of the cave here. So this is Socrates speaking. "And now," I said, "let me show in a figure how far our nature is enlightened or unenlightened. Behold, human beings living in an underground den, which has a mouth open toward the light and reaching all along the den. Here they have been from their childhood and have their legs and necks chained, so they cannot move, and can only see before them, being prevented by the chains from turning round their heads. Above and behind them a fire is blazing at a distance, and between the fire and the prisoners there is a raised way, and you will see, if you look, a low wall built along the way, like the screen which marionette players have in front of them, over which they show the puppets." Glaucon says, "I see." Socrates picks up the thread. "And do you see," I said, "men passing along the wall carrying all sorts of vessels and statues and figures of animals made of wood and stone and various materials, which appear over the wall. Some of them are talking, others silent." Glaucon says, "You have shown me a strange image, and they are strange prisoners." Socrates replies, "Like ourselves." And I'll pause there. Okay, Socrates then says, like ourselves, this description he's just given, that's us. What exactly does he mean? Clearly, Plato wants us to pause at this point here and take this strange story and interpret it allegorically to see how it applies to us philosophically. What's our situation? How is it that we are like those strange prisoners in that strange den with the fire and the figures and the raised way and this, that, and the other thing? Okay, strange story, just presented abstractly so far by some reading here. Let's go back to the whiteboard, and here I have an image. My rendition of Plato's cave set up, and so here we have the underground den or the underground cave. And here's our prisoner. I'll just use one in this particular case. He says this guy's been sitting here since birth, chained right to the floor, and he's chained in such a way that he can't turn his head around, so he only has to look that way toward the back of the cave. Behind him, and raised up a little bit, Plato says there's a fire, a large fire burning brightly, so there's my aesthetically pleasing fire. And there's also a low wall, and behind the low wall, he says there's some other figures. These guys are a little bit odd, and they are holding sticks on which there are things made out of various materials. He said some of them are animals, and so I've got this guy holding a horse, and this guy holding a figure of a dog. And he says there's some of them are silent, some of them are making rounds. So I'm going to imagine that this guy is, just running around back and forth here, neighing like a horse, neigh, neigh. And this guy's running around back here, following him with a little yappy dog, yip, 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 chasing after the horse. Now, this guy, of course, will hear the sounds, but what will he be seeing? Well, he's not looking back this way, and if he were, he wouldn't be able to see past this anyway. Instead, what he sees is the back of the cave, and what we see on the cave, because of the fire and these being positioned where they are going to be some kind of shadowy, not just shadowy, but actual shadows. There's the horse running back and forth saying neigh, and behind the horse we've got this little tiny shadow of a dog going yip, 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 chasing after the horse. And so this guy hears and sees a horse being chased by a dog. All right, so that's the scenario. In what way then is this like us? And what I want to commend to you as a brilliant allegory is the myth of the cave here philosophically, because I think if you interpret it and tweak it and push it as Plato intends, then it captures all of the major elements of an idealistic way of considering our situation. This allegory is metaphysical, it's epistemological, it says something about human nature, and then when we read a little bit more, there are some ethical implications that Plato teases out, all of it applied to our central concern, which is education. All right, so in what way is this metaphysical? Well, we do have an underground cave, and presumably there's an above ground, and I've got that represented here where we have trees, right, and then the sun and all of that kind of thing. So what we have then is a lower world and a higher world. So I'll put that here in terms of the metaphysics. All right, we have a distinction between the higher world and the lower world. And clearly this world is a whole lot darker, a lot more shadowy. The ventilation's probably not that great, so it's probably kind of smelly. Out here, by contrast, the air is pure, everything is bright and really living. Okay, epistemologically, what is the implication here? Well, this guy's been trapped here from birth in this lower world, so as far as he knows and as far as he believes, this is the only world, this is all that he knows, and so he thinks that he is really seeing a horse, and he's really seeing a dog, and he's seeing whatever else is being projected over the wall here. But what he is really seeing are things that are not really fully real. Instead, they are imperfect reflections or participations in something that is beyond his comprehension, that is more real, more significant. These guys back here, and of course these things that we know from our exalted perspective, these aren't really real. There are real horses and real dogs that are even more real than these things here. And so in effect, this is like the triangle in the exercise that I did a little bit earlier. When I put the triangle on the board, we all thought, oh yeah, well that's a triangle, but that's just from our limited earthbound perspective. It's not a real triangle because it's not perfect and so forth. So what Plato then here is suggesting at the outset is, if this person is representative of us, what we have taken for most of our lives to be real knowledge about the real world is in fact a lower order of knowledge, or perhaps not even knowledge at all. So what we have then here epistemologically is a notion of what Plato calls merely opinion or belief, but that belief is very distant from what we can call actual truth. Now, human nature, this is like us, right? In what way is this guy sitting at the bottom of a smelly cave, chained to the floor, like us? Plato would say, well, obviously the representation here is to capture our soul or our mind's relationship to the body. This guy is chained rather to the floor, and that is preventing him rather from rising up and achieving a higher order of knowledge and truth. And the same thing holds for us. It's our bodies, right? Our souls are trapped in our bodies, or chained to our bodies. Our minds are chained to this lower reality, and that is preventing our minds and our souls from reaching their higher aspiration. So we have a view here of human nature. what we have then is the body chaining and holding back the soul, right, or the mind, and preventing it from achieving its higher destiny. All right, good start. 1, 2, 3. We haven't said anything about ethics. To get to the ethics, we need to bring in some more elements of the allegory of the cave. So let me get my text here and we'll read a little bit more. All right, I want to jump ahead a little bit here. There's a passage where Socrates has explained this allegory a little bit more here, and he says to Glaucon, "And now look again and see what will naturally follow if the prisoners are released and disabused of their error. At first, when any of them is liberated and compelled suddenly to stand up and turn his neck round and walk towards the light, he will suffer sharp pains. The glare will distress him, and he will be unable to see the realities of which his former state he had seen in the shadows." Okay, what's just happened is, if we take this person as our representative prisoner here, this prisoner is released, he stands up, he turns around, and he looks toward the light. And a couple of things are significant here. First thing is a cognitive step. This person is going from a state of relative ignorance to a state of relative knowledge. Having done so, he is in a position now to say, oh, hey, wait a minute, that which I thought was real before really is an illusion or a lesser reality. And now I can see these things here. I am in better possession, right, of knowledge. So the process of education, right, has begun. And so here we have Plato introducing one of the educational implications. But notice also what he has said about the process of education. And here he is weighing in on and taking sides on one of the great controversies in educational circles. Is it the case that education is something that is pleasurable, joyful, something that we all naturally want to do and are inclined to do? Are we naturally curious, wanting to develop our faculties, right, and so forth? Plato is saying here, or suggesting here fairly emphatically, that it is not. That is not true. By having the person stand up and turn toward the light, and emphasizing the fact that in the process of doing so, the glare hurts his eyes. He suffers sharp pains. Plato is making the point, that's the point that he returns to regularly, that education is a painful process. It's not a pleasurable process. It's also not something that we naturally want to do. We naturally recoil from pain, so it makes sense then to infer that we're not going to naturally do very much by way of education, because that is a painful process. So the process of education, the process of coming to be enlightened, is a painful process. Plato is making that suggestion here, and it's an important one. Another important feature of this passage here is that he puts it in the passive voice from the perspective of the person who is the chained prisoner. The guy ends up in a position looking toward the back of the stage, the cave rather, and so has achieved a modest amount of enlightenment here. How did that come about? Well, there's a couple of possibilities. One is to say that he got curious, or he got otherwise interested in releasing himself, found a way to break his chains, stood himself up, turned around, and proceeded to explore. That's not what Plato says here. He does not do it himself. Instead, it's somebody else who does it for him. Notice what we have here. I'll repeat this. At first, when any of them is liberated and compelled suddenly to stand up and turn his neck around and walk toward the light. So what we have then is an implication that somebody else is doing the liberating. Someone comes along here, breaks the chain, forces this guy to stand up, makes his head turn around and look toward the back of the cave. And that person is the teacher. Right? The teacher is someone who necessarily forces education upon the person. Left to his own devices, this guy would sit here wallowing in ignorance forever, but fortunately for him, from Plato's perspective, somebody comes along who has his best interests at heart, realizes that he's in a state of ignorance, and uses compulsion to break him from the bonds of ignorance, free his mind from his body, and make him do something that he ordinarily wouldn't want to do. All right, so another point here that's important, Plato is weighing in on another major issue in education. Is education something that we engage in voluntarily? Is it a matter of an inner motivation that should be encouraged? Or is education something that requires an authority figure that has to be forced on students in a top-down fashion and perhaps even by means of a compulsion fashion? And Plato is leaning strongly toward the latter in that case. All right, this is just the initial stage of enlightenment. Plato goes on to have the person rise up out of the cave and eventually get up here to the real world. But I want to point out the language that he uses here. When we get to that point, after the guy's eyes have accustomed themselves to the very bright light coming from the fire, Socrates then says, so here's the next step. And suppose once more that he is reluctantly dragged up a steep and rugged ascent. All right, the guy has to be dragged right up the educational process, and he is reluctant to do so, and held fast until he is forced into the presence of the sun himself. Is he not likely to be pained and irritated? So the teacher takes charge of this person, drags him reluctantly up, and the upward is the direction of enlightenment, until finally here we have the guy out here in the sun. And after a while, his eyes get used to that extraordinary bright. Initially, he can't even look toward the sun, but once he's out here, he is then happy and has reached a state of enlightenment. He can see real trees, he can see the real sun, he can see various other animals and other things that are going on. Okay, now, the sun is important here. We can interpret the sun allegorically, obviously, at all. The sun is the source of all light, hence enlightenment. The sun is the source of all warmth. The sun rather is the source of all being. And so in non-religious idealism, we can just use the sun allegorically as that which is the highest source that makes everything possible, the highest stage of enlightenment, whatever that is. In more religious forms of idealism, the sun can be and has been a stand-in for God or the gods, and so we can interpret this as achieving a kind of cognitive reunion with God himself. Okay, so we have a happy story from the idealist perspective here. Person wallowing in ignorance now has achieved enlightenment, or at least has been dragged in the direction by a teacher against his will, suffered enormous pains to get to the point where he can experience enlightenment, and the story is not over. All right, ethics. We have had some ethical import so far in that the natural relationship between the initial teacher of this person is a compulsory authoritarian top-down relationship. So we can say we have an authoritarian approach that emphasizes the necessity of pain and suffering along the way to the achievement of the good, and the necessity of compulsion in order to get people to endure the pain and suffering to do the things that they otherwise would not do and want to do for themselves allegorically. All right, Plato has one problem philosophically at this point here. This guy is now out of the cave. He is free. All right, and that's a good thing. He is enlightened, right, and that is a good thing. He has the whole perfect higher world to explore, and presumably it's potentially unending. And so this guy could pursue happiness freely up here in this beautiful world until his death, whenever that happens to occur. And so the question then would be, is Plato then going to urge ethically that the whole point of getting out of the cave is so that you can be free, right, as an individual, to pursue your happiness, to pursue your good life in a fully enlightened kind of way? And that is just not Plato's ethical system at all. Plato is much more communal in his ethic, much more self-sacrificial in his ethic, much more altruistic in his ethic. And so what he needs is to find a way to get this guy back into the cave, because presumably there are still lots of other people down here wallowing in ignorance. How can we get this guy to give up all of this wonderful stuff that waits for him up here in the higher and true world, to go back into this smelly old cave and to deal with these people who are in need. And so what Plato then does a little bit later is indicate how this is going to come about. Socrates picks up the thread again, and when he, that is to say the prisoner, or the former prisoner rather, who is now free, remembered his old habitation and the wisdom of the den and his fellow prisoners, do you not suppose that he would felicitate himself on the change and pity them? And Glaucon says certainly he would. All right, now notice the word that Plato is using here, at least in English translation. The word here is pity. I am free. I have wonderful opportunities awaiting for me, lots of happiness and so forth, but when I remember these people back here in the cave in their miserable situation, what I feel is pity. And that pity is to motivate me to give up all of the wonderful possibilities that are waiting for me out here and to go back and help those who are in need. Now notice Plato here is again weighing in on another major divide in educational debates. What is the proper motivation of teachers? Right? Is it the case that if you're thinking about becoming a teacher, you're becoming a teacher because you say, well, I really like kids. I really get excited by their curiosity. I like spending time with them, all of their energy, their positive and so forth. I love to see the light of learning and the aha moments that happen in their face and their pride when they master some new skill and so forth. And so that's why I want to be a teacher. I can't imagine anything that will give me a bigger charge as a career. Plato was saying, no, that is not your proper motivation as a teacher. That is an egoistic motivation, right? That's a self-interested motivation. Of course, it's good for the students as well. It's a win-win proposition here. But what Plato is concerned is that proper motivation is not self-interested. You're doing it out of a sense of obligation to those whom you pity. And your obligation requires a sacrifice to you. You could enjoy wonderful things, right, in your newfound state of enlightenment and knowledge. You give up all of that, you return to the less desirable state in order to deal with people who need you and who probably are not going to be particularly grateful. Now this point about gratitude and how the transition to being a teacher comes about, Plato also attends. And we can work this through ourselves without attending to the text. But imagine this person then says, okay, I pity these poor people down here. I will give up my pursuit of higher truth in this beautiful world up here. I will go back down into the cave and educate them. So he goes back down into the cave. How does that go? Well, he's been in the bright light for a while. He's going back down into a dark cave. Naturally, he's going to be very awkward, stumbling around, not being able to find his way very clearly, but at the same time he has this very important knowledge to share and some enthusiasm for it, so he comes rushing down into the cave, stumbling around, saying, hey everybody, listen to me, I have seen the light and I want you to come and follow me. All right, so he comes back into the cave and he starts exhorting these people to do what he says. Now the reaction of these people, of course, is naturally to dismiss him as a kook, as a crazy person, as someone not to be attended to. You've seen the light, yeah, right. Tell me another one. Or if you're so smart, what do you see on the back of the wall right here? What is that? And the guy says, oh, I don't know, my eyes haven't adjusted to the dim lights down here. I'm only concerned with higher truths and another reality. And these guys will say, oh yeah, sure, you're so smart. Anybody can see that that's a dog chasing a horse. Why should we possibly listen to you? So it's going to go with that sort of a social dynamic. These people are likely to refuse to listen to the enlightened person who has their best interests at heart. So what's our way out of the problem here? Well, if these people are not going to listen to you voluntarily, but you nonetheless do in fact know what is best for them, they don't know what is best for them, then the moral thing to do, what is morally not only legitimate for you to do, but morally required for you to do, is to use compulsion. After all, it was compulsion that was used upon you to drag you up to enlightenment, so necessarily it's your part to complete the cycle, to come back and use compulsion on those who are initially going to be ungrateful, initially resistant, initially who will dislike you for what you're going to do to them and are doing to them, but it's for their own good. There is a higher truth at stake here, and you as the person in possession of it are obligated to bring other people to being in a possession of that higher truth. So you break their chains, you force them to stand up, you drag them reluctantly up and into the sunlight, and the cycle continues. All right, so we then have the authoritarian pain and suffering compulsion built into the process when the former student becomes a teacher and carries on in that particular direction. Okay, whether one is an idealist or not, this is a brilliant allegory. It's brilliant literarily. It's also brilliant because it fits philosophically. It touches all of the major issues in philosophy. We can read off Plato's metaphysics, his epistemology, his view of human nature, and the ethics. And we have a wonderful literary analogy to interpret it in terms of, and we can then see, for our purposes, the educational implications that are going to fall out of it, at least in broad terms so far. All right, what I want to do next is turn to another idealist. We're going to jump forward, 1,800 years plus about 400 years, so about 2,200 years, to Immanuel Kant. Kant died in 1804, so from our perspective, he seems like an ancient guy, but in historical terms, he's very modern, and he is one of the great influential idealist thinkers of the modern era. And he will be a useful complement in some respects and also a contrast to Plato. So let me turn next to Immanuel Kant. All right, with Immanuel Kant, we have one of the great thinkers in the modern idealist tradition who has also been influential on education. When we read the Plato selection, interpreted the myth of the cave, there were metaphysical, epistemological, human nature, and ethics implications. In the selection I want to focus on here from Kant's lectures on education, I just want to focus on Kant as an ethicist. We have seen when we read the Plato selection that there was an emphasis on an authoritarian approach to education, on the use of compulsion, on education as a somewhat painful process that we don't necessarily want to do. And in varying degrees, that has been a core theme throughout idealist traditions, both in the religious, traditional religious schools and in the more secular idealistic schools. First, in this selection here, Kant mentions that education is, in addition, of course, to having a cognitive component, most essentially concerned with morality. He is one of those thinkers for whom morality and forming character is the top educational priority, or at least one of the top two, right, educational priorities. The reason in part for that is that on Kant's view, having a good moral character is one of the most important things, if not the most important thing in adult life, and so it should necessarily be so for child's life, but also that he sees the formation of character as a precondition for almost anything else that can happen in education. Kant has a fairly strongly pessimistic view of the original condition of human beings. We are beings dominated by sin and by weakness, and so education has to take this into account seriously from the outset. All right, so first let me read a little bit and then we'll comment and then we'll move on. All right, first, if we wish to form the characters of children, it is of the greatest importance to point out to them a certain plan and certain rules in everything, and that these must be strictly adhered to. For instance, they must have set times for sleep, for work, and for pleasure, and these times must be neither shortened nor lengthened. All right, so the first point here is a certain amount of strictness, a certain amount of set time, a certain amount of scheduling. The scheduling has to come from authoritative source, the parent, right, or the teachers, because in Kant's view, they're naturally undisciplined. They're chaotic. They're more likely to do anything by means of the whim of the moment. So we have to devise a schedule and we have to impose it, right, upon the students. We have to impose it upon them strictly. Children don't take to this very well, but if we're going to teach them, it has to be something that we cannot compromise on. We can't allow deviations, otherwise the natural unruliness of children will be out of control. So we have to get them used to strictness, discipline, top-down authority right from the bat. Now, for children to do so, there's going to be obedience required of them, and that's the thesis that Kant turns to immediately following. Quote, above all things, right, let me pause here. When a philosopher says above all things, right, that's his way of flashing it in neon lights, even though they didn't have neon lights in the 18th century, but, quote, above all things, obedience is an essential feature in the character of a child. All right, so what Kant is signaling here is that the very first thing we have to attend to in education is obedience, getting the child to be obedient. The number one positive character trait is the trait of obedience. And while Kant is a somewhat secularized thinker with great affinities to the religious way of thinking, here we have Kant as a modern thinker, nonetheless hearkening back to the very earliest of the idealist traditions, at least in the Western tradition. If we think back to the book of Genesis in the Bible, the very first story that we have about human beings acting independently is the great sin. And what was the great sin that human beings first engaged in? Well, it was the sin of disobedience, right? So the story there, right from the very beginning of that tradition, is emphasizing that human beings are by nature disobedience. Disobedience is the great sin, and so by contrast, obedience must be the top virtue, or the number one virtue that we have to instill in. There is therefore a continuity with that tradition, and Kant being a more recent exemplar of that. All right, obedience is the important trait here. How do we instill a sense of dutiful obedience in students? That is what Kant turns to next. How are we going to get students to do so? We know that initially we have to put it upon them and make them do it, but that's only a first step. Eventually what we want is for people to internalize an obedient character and to do it themselves properly. So when we start getting inside the minds and spirits of students, how do we get them properly to motivate themselves and to act accordingly? So in the next paragraph, Kant turns to that very issue. And I'll read a little bit here, and he weighs in on another major issue in education. Quote, one often hears it said that we should put everything before children in such a way that they do it from inclination. Right? Now, what is it to say that students will have things put before them in such a way that they will do it from inclination? Well, one approach to education is to say that what we should do is try to have students naturally motivated to play upon their natural motivation, their natural curiosity, their natural desire to explore. And so education, in part, consists of putting attractive things in front of them, waiting for them to show an interest, and then once they show interest, to facilitate that and to piggyback various lessons on that. All right, and that is the position then that Kant is reacting to, and he is saying that is not what education should consist in. I'm making heavy weather of this point right now because Kant has in mind the thinker John Locke, whom he has read, an earlier thinker by about a century. Locke is coming from the realist tradition, which we'll be considering in the next unit, and here is Kant's then response to Locke and disagreeing with him and those others who believe in the inclination and self-motivation approach here. Kant goes on to say, and again, quote, in some cases it is true, and that's all very well, but there is much besides which we must place before them as duty. And a duty, again, stepping outside of the quote, is something that you do whether you are inclined to do it or not. It's not a matter of whether you want to or not. It's a matter of something that you have to do, that you are supposed to do, and your proper motivation is a dutiful motivation. Kant then goes on to explain why, quote, and this will be of great use to them later throughout their life. For in the paying of rates and taxes, in the work of the office, and in many other cases, we must be led not by inclination, but by duty. And notice here that Kant has sketched out most of the major areas of life, our political life, our life in paying taxes, our life at work, right, and so forth. Life is primarily about duty. It's about having obligations, grown-up responsibilities. There's not a lot of time for pleasure and inclination and doing whatever you happen to feel about. That's not what adult life is like. That's not what the moral life is like. Life is about duty and obligation, and the sooner children learn this lesson, the more the better, rather, their education is going to be. All right, so Kant then goes on to consider what is likely to happen next. We have this strict schedule that we are putting on students. We're trying to teach them discipline. We are putting lots of duties and obligations upon them, but naturally this is not something that they want to do. Children being children, human beings being human beings, what's going to happen next? Well, there's going to be lots and lots of disobedience. We are disobedient creatures. We are a sinful creature. We are a willful inclination kind of creature. We don't obey, and Kant then takes up this subject. Quote, every transgression of a command in a child is a want of obedience, and this brings punishment with it. Naturally, sin, the consequence is punishment. Disobedience requires punishment, and so Kant now takes up the subject of punishment in the educational context, and for several pages, it must be said, Kant goes into great detail in the different kinds of sins and punishments that students will engage in, and the appropriate kinds of punishments that are appropriate for all of those subcategories of sin and disobedience. And so this is something then that is meant for teachers to take under advisement, looking for all of the kinds of disobediences that are going to happen, and having ready a repertoire of punishments that are appropriate for the kind of obedience or disobedience rather that is involved. All right, after several pages of discussing all of the disobediences that children are going to engage in and the various kinds of punishments that are appropriate, Kant steps back a little bit and realizes the kind of picture that he is painting here. He's not an extreme by any means in terms of the pessimism of his view of human nature and the amount and severity of punishment that he thinks is necessary in an idealist school. And so he issues a kind of a qualification or a cautionary note. And so I want to read just one more passage to you. It's one that struck me when I read it for the first time, as I think it goes a long way to giving a sense for how Kant speaking for not only himself but many people in the idealist tradition, what school or what the feeling of being in school is like, and perhaps some of us can relate to this as well. Kant says in this passage here, quote, "Children should sometimes be released from the narrow constraint of school. Otherwise, their natural joyousness will soon be quenched." So he recognizes that children are naturally joyous creatures, and he doesn't think that's an entirely bad thing. But nonetheless, school is not a place where there's going to be much room for natural childish joyousness. And so the indication here seems to be joyousness and having fun and being a child, that's fine. We'll make a place for that, but that's not what school is for. School is a very different kind of place. School is serious business. School is about focus. It's about discipline. It's about strictness. It's about obedience. It's about duty. And that is what we are about when we are in school. But we don't want to destroy the child's natural joyousness entirely, so we should build in some recess, some lunch breaks, and have after-school activities so as not to totally quench that spirit. Okay, that's all I want to do in the case of Kant. There's a great deal of more in Kant's lectures on education. In this case, I wanted to focus a little bit more on the ethics of idealist education as represented by Kant, and see the connections in terms of the issue of punishment, compulsion, and top-down authoritarianism that goes all the way back to Plato. And certainly if we have any familiarity with traditional religious schooling, there are commonalities in that approach to schooling as well. That is idealism philosophically as applied to education. To close out our discussion of idealism as a philosophy, I want to make three direct connections to educational implications that have held true for most idealist systems throughout the course of the history of education. There are lots and lots of details to work out, and many variations are possible there, but there are three themes that one can look for and see instantiated in idealistic systems of education that almost always are big tip-offs that one is dealing with someone in an idealistic tradition or an institution so forth. We know that idealism metaphysically emphasizes the higher world over the lower physical world and sees the lower world as of less intrinsic interest or perhaps of no interest at all. It's much more interested in the abstract, it's more interested in the eternal, and so forth. Now, the way this turns out educationally and becomes institutionalized is, as I've got it here in point 1, is that idealistic education is very much theory heavy and practice light. Right? It emphasizes theoretical education and is not very much interested in practical education. In many cases, it is the idealist tradition that is primarily responsible for the notion of ivory tower approach to education. The idea then is that the educated person goes up into the ivory tower, or the professor, and basically stays in the ivory tower, and the ivory tower is a bunch of abstracted theoretical speculation, and it may have absolutely nothing to do with real life, right, or the practical concerns of the world. And there could be a number of components here, an emphasis on the abstract over the experiential. So one pedagogical issue that becomes important is how we deliver things to students. Do we have the professor stand and deliver an abstract lecture to students, or is it the case that we're going to emphasize the experiential, where students are doing hands-on sorts of things? You'll find very little experiential education in idealism. Instead, you will have a very intellectually oriented abstract set of deliveries. And that is reiterated in this point here. We're interested in the intellectual side of life. We're not interested in the applied side of life. And a formulation you might have heard is the idea of knowledge for its own sake. That is to say, the realm of knowledge, the realm of the intellectual, dealing as it is with higher order abstractions, that exists for its own sake. It has no intrinsic necessary or value connection to anything outside of it, much less the lower applied physical world and so forth. We see, for example, in some schools of mathematics, there is often a distinction between pure mathematicians and applied mathematicians. And the mark of an idealist culture in that mathematics department is if there's tension between those two sides of the mathematics department, and particularly if the pure mathematicians in some sense see them as better, as more significant, as higher up the totem pole, so to speak, because they're dealing with mathematics purely and they're not getting their hands dirty as those applied mathematicians who are practically on the way to being engineers, way down the order of being, right, so to speak. I've got a couple of quotations here that are representative of this idealistic way of thinking philosophically as it applies to educational matters here. One ancient, one modern, to get a sense of the continuity of this position over great stretches of time. The first I have is a quotation about Archimedes, taken from Plutarch's Lives. It's actually from the essay that Plutarch wrote on Marcellus. But in the course of that, he has an extended discussion here of Archimedes, Archimedes being one of the great mathematicians of the ancient world. So I'll read this to you now. Quote, "Yet Archimedes possessed so high a spirit, so profound a soul, and such treasures of scientific knowledge, that these inventions had now obtained him the renown of more than human sagacity, he yet would not deign to leave behind him any commentary or writing on such subjects, but repudiating as sordid and ignoble the whole trade of engineering, and every sort of art that lends itself to mere use and profit. He placed his whole affection and ambition in those purer speculations where there can be no reference to the vulgar needs of life, studies the superiority of which to all others is unquestioned, and in which the only doubt can be whether the beauty and grandeur of the subjects examined, or the precision and cogency of the methods and means of proof most deserve our admiration." All right, fairly clear example of idealism in practice. We're only interested in the higher, purer abstraction, and we dismiss with a sneer anything that has to do with practical life, right, so to speak. All right, that has big implications for education in practice. My more recent example is from another mathematician, G.H. Hardy, Englishman, brilliant mind. His dates are 1877 to 1947, so he straddled the late 19th century and early 20th century world. Quote, this is from his memoirs, and he's speaking proudly of his achievements here. He says, quote, "I have never done anything, quote, useful. No discovery of mine has made or is likely to make directly or indirectly, for good or ill, the least difference to the amenity of the world," unquote. All right, and he holds that to be one of his great accomplishments and something that he is especially proud of. Yeah, the point being that he spent his life mathematically in the world of theory, and the world of theory has absolutely nothing to do with the world of practice, so there's never going to be any connection between his theoretical work and his practical world, and that is the best kind of life and the best kind of career for him as a mathematician. All right, the second point I want to make in terms of idealist practice, implications of idealist philosophy for education, has to do with curricular issues, deciding in a broad stroke what would be included on the curriculum and what would not be included on the curriculum. And this is certainly one of the big rubber meets the road issues for the connection between philosophical theory and educational practice. So what I want to do is just broadly divide the curriculum into two categories here: things that we would include and things that we would not include. And we'll consider some standard curricular elements and see how an idealist would think through whether to include those things on the curriculum or not. Now, there's some obvious candidates. If we are, for example, religious idealists, then as religious idealists, we almost always have an approved scripture that is part of our tradition, and so a major part of the curriculum is going to be our scripture. Okay. If we are not religious idealists, if we're more secular in our idealistic approach, as say Plato was and perhaps Kant was, then we're not going to teach simply out of scripture. But what we are interested in is things that are not physical in their orientation, not bodily, not concrete. We are interested in things that are abstract, that are pure, that train the student's mind in that direction. And so one very obvious candidate is mathematics. And it's, I don't think, an accident that historically many of the great mathematicians have found themselves attracted to idealist forms of philosophy. So we can do math, geometry, algebra, and so on up to higher order mathematics, and that would certainly be a legitimate thing. We might say psychology is a legitimate thing to include in the curriculum because of the nature of its subject matter. Psychology studies the psyche, and of course, as idealists, we would be more likely to study the psyche in dualistic terms. But if our subject matter is the mind, the spirit, the soul, the apparatus, right, of consciousness, our consciousness, and so forth, coming to understand that certainly can be, from an idealist perspective, a worthy subject matter. Okay, how about literature? Right? Would we include literature in the tradition? Here, I think, as an idealist, there are any number of answers that are possible. One thing we might say is, well, we already have scripture, and we don't need to have any literature beyond scripture, in that scripture is a self-contained and universal source of truth here. And if we are very doctrinaire in our approach, we might want to say we don't want to have any confusing bodies of literature presenting different accounts of the human condition, because that would be confusing to the students, and so we might not allow any literature other than studying the scripture, for example, as literature. If we're more liberal in our religion, or if we're not religious as idealists, we would, I think, include literature as an important subject matter, but the literature included would have to meet certain standards. In many cases, the standards that are going to be met are moral standards. We want to make moral education a central part of what education is about. Literature certainly can be a very useful vehicle for exploring issues of character, good versus evil, and dramatizing and concretizing things in a way that are accessible to students. And so if we're interested in training moral character, literature can be very useful that way. But we do, of course, want to make sure that the right moral lesson comes through in the literature that we choose. And so we would choose works of literature that involve moral themes of good, according to our conception, triumphing over evil, rather than any sort of a dystopian novel or an anti-hero type of novel. Those, I think, would not make the cut if we are idealists in our approach. So we might have a moral criterion in this particular case. Here, Harry Potter, the phenomenon of the wild success of the Harry Potter novels and their enormous popularity among students who are learning to read and advancing in leaps and bounds in their reading ability. If we think of the controversy over the Harry Potter novels, many students or many teachers rather, are very happy to include the Harry Potter novels in the curriculum, just for the fact that the students are reading something and they're reading it voraciously, and there are lots of things that can be talked about there, and there are moral issues in there as well. But if we think about the opposition to the inclusion of the Harry Potter novels, those almost always come from an idealist perspective, particularly a competitor idealist perspective. The idea being then the Harry Potter novels that you do have lots of beings that come out of the idealist tradition. You do have spirits and demons, right, and ghosts and magical powers and so forth, and a fairly full apparatus of supernaturalism, an alternate world, a higher world that is better than the grubby world of the Muggles, right, so to speak. But from many idealists or many religious idealist perspective, it's the wrong account of the supernatural phenomenon that is being taught there instead of the right account of supernatural phenomenon that is being taught. And so, in effect, on metaphysical grounds, they will dismiss the Harry Potter novels as well. Some religious idealists also will object to the Harry Potter novels on moral grounds, because they will make the argument that Harry Potter, for example, if you see all of the things that he does, he's almost always breaking the rules, right? There are rules that are put in place for the good of the children, and not a chapter goes by that he doesn't break one or several of the rules, and he's luring his friends into breaking the rules as well. He thinks of himself as above the rules. He thinks he's special. He's disrespectful to various teachers and so forth. And so in many cases, the moral character traits, or the character traits rather, that Harry Potter represents, while admirable and attractive to some moral traditions, are anathema to many religious idealist traditions, and so they will object to the inclusion of Harry Potter in the curriculum on that grounds. So, first point being, the literature would have to satisfy moral criteria if we're going to include it for that purpose as a vehicle for teaching character. The other thing that is important to emphasize in the idealist approach is that the idealists, particularly those that are more liberal, will emphasize the classics, and they will not have a doctrinaire approach, only teach literary works with which they agree, philosophically or morally speaking, but they will argue that any classic work of literature almost could and should be a candidate for inclusion in the curriculum. And so what we want is to encourage students to read the classics, or we want to have them read the great books, recognizing that the classics tradition and the great books tradition, there's lots of debates and ongoing discussions about all sorts of issues, and so chances are good, if I am an idealist professor or an idealist teacher, I'm going to disagree with a substantial number of the books that I would be reading with my students. But the idea here and the rationale for the classics is that if something is a classic work, what it means for something to be a classic work is that generation upon generation of very smart, educated, informed people have recommended that work. Right? So 2,000 years ago, right, smart people recommended that book to their students, who the smartest among them in turn recommended it to their students, and so forth. And so chances are very good, if a book has stood the test of time in that way, it must be on to something important. It must be probing some universal theme or some deeply important theme, an issue in the human condition, or it must be teaching something that all human beings across time in different cultures can relate to, and as human beings generally should relate to. And so in that description that I just ran through, right, things that are eternal, right, that are universal, that cross cultures and so forth, that speak to the human condition, right, in a general way. All of those are concepts that are good concepts, right, for an idealist, and so we would be more likely then to find things of lasting value in the classic works, and then by contrast, works that are modern works. It's very hard from our limited perspective to tell whether a modern work is going to stand the test of time, or whether it's a more culture-bound or time-bound judgment that we're making that makes it seem like it's an instant classic, right, so to speak. So, from an idealist perspective, works of literature that are classics and or exemplifying good moral character in the heroes and heroines, those I think would be natural candidates and so on. Okay, so those are 4 items that are likely to be included in idealist curricula. Let's now try to think by contrast of things that idealists would be more likely not to include in the curriculum, or if they included in the curriculum, it would be under severely constrained circumstances. One likely candidate would be physical education. One of the interesting traditions in the stronger idealist schools is that they won't include physical education in the curriculum. Some of them are an exception for various reasons here, but the rationale is fairly clear. The physical education is concerning itself with the body. If philosophically we think the body is of less importance, not very significant, that the important thing is the soul or the mind, and we should be devoting our scarce educational resources only to things that are really important, then that's necessarily going to lead to a downplaying and a de-emphasis on physical education. Now, we might say physical education can get included in the curriculum. After all, we are physical beings, and part of learning to be a good person is learning how to control your body. And so we might have certain kinds of disciplines that are built into the curriculum that can be called physical education, learning how to control and discipline and restrain your body and train it to act in the appropriate kind of way. Okay, what about biology? Right? What about chemistry? What about physics? All of the things that are in the natural sciences. Would we include those in an idealist curriculum? Interestingly, historically, many of the ancient and medieval idealist schools of education would not include the natural sciences in the curriculum. So I'm going to put that on the list here. Great controversy here, and certainly some qualifications that have to be added as we get into the modern world. But if we think again as strict principled idealists, we are going to say we are not interested in the physical world. The physical world is low, corrupt, transitory, and so forth. Our true calling and station is not of this world. We should devote our scarce educational resources and scarce psychological resources only rather to things that really matter. And the only thing that really matters is the higher world. When we're studying the natural sciences, well, what are we studying? We're studying rocks, we're studying trees, we're studying worms, we're studying animals, and so forth. And those things are not very dignified. They're not important in the grand scheme of things. Why on earth would we devote scarce educational resources to things that are of no particular example? If we're going to do the natural sciences, we're going to be using our senses a lot, and we're not particularly interested in sensory education, senses just to keep us in contact with the natural world. We should not have the lust of the eyes and the lust of the ears and so forth. Instead, we should be inward and focused upwardly. Now, one of the compromises or evolutions, however one wants to characterize it, as idealists who are not particularly religious have gotten to rather as we got into the modern world is making a place for the natural sciences, but to the extent that it is idealist educators who are making the decisions, it's been a very slow evolution and a fairly hard-fought battle. Now we can see in many cases right down to our time, if we think about the natural sciences are, from religious idealist perspective, always controversial. We're having this great, huge, ongoing battle, and we have had for a century and a half, about the theory of evolution. If it's the case that a natural science is going off in a certain direction and that contradicts or seems to contradict and pose great problems for a religious tradition that one thinks is true, then of course, from the perspective of a religious idealist, you do not include that science in your curriculum. And so the practice right down to our time is, particularly in some of the stronger religious idealist traditions, not to include the natural sciences, or especially the natural sciences that seem to be in tension with traditional religious doctrine. All right, one other one I want to put up here on the board as something that is not as likely to be included in an idealist curriculum is art. And this might be initially surprising, but again, the rationale for this is fairly clear. If we think on the religious side of the divide, the great Western traditions in religion, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, the art traditions that come out of Judaism are fairly minimal. The art traditions that come out of Islam, again, are fairly minimal and tend to be focused only in the graphics direction. And even for the longest time in the Christian tradition, there was no such thing as an artistic tradition. In the early generations and centuries of Christianity, it was Christians who would in many cases be destroying works of art, banning theatrical productions on the grounds that they were blasphemous, and so forth. And it was a great compromise within the Christian tradition partway through the later medieval world that enabled a reintroduction of architecture that emphasized perceptual grandeur. If you think of the cathedrals that then came to be built, the use of stained glass windows and attending to the aesthetic issues there and the beauties that can come out of there. And those were seen as controversies. They were very hard fought and bitterly so. Within that tradition, and the rationale was that, well, we can open the door a little bit here for art as long as it is for the glory of God. If we think, for example, of stained glass windows, many of the people who are sitting in the churches and in the cathedrals are illiterate, and they're listening to a priest give the service in Latin, which they don't understand. While their minds are wandering, they might as well wander to beautiful stained glass windows in which there is represented, say, a biblical story, and so there's still some spiritual edification there as well. So in the Catholic tradition, once that controversy died down, a lively tradition in the visual arts developed, great cathedral buildings, stained glass windows, and it evolved then into fresco paintings and other kinds of painting and sculpture and so forth. Although interestingly, again, within the religious tradition, the same Christian religious tradition, it was the Protestant reformers in the 1500s who were reacting so strongly against that, going back to what they thought was a purer idealism, that one is not, as a religious person, concerned with the physical, with anything that appeals to the senses, that rather we turn our backs on the physical world and we direct our spirits toward the higher world. So in the religious idealist tradition, art always has been suspect. If you think also about music even, which can be very mathematical and can elevate the spirits, even that is controversial within the religious traditions, because music, the way it operates on us psychologically, seems to also influence our body. And so if I'm listening to some music and I like it, I might start tapping my fingers, start tapping my feet, I might get up and move around, and that leads to dancing, and dancing leads to boys and girls checking each other out, and that leads to eroticism and sexuality, and there again we're back into physicality again, and so we better close the door. No dancing. Dancing, that particular art, also can be suspect. But interestingly also, if you go to the non-religious side of idealism, there's also been a great deal of distrust for art as well. If we go back to Plato, for example, whom we looked at a little bit earlier in his great work, The Republic, his final book, Book 10, half of that book is devoted to an extended argument for strong censorship of the arts, an attack on the artists as corrupters of humankind, as pretenders to certain kinds of knowledge. And Plato has his character Socrates argue that there should not be any artists in the ideal city, including literary artists, that they would all be banned. Toward the end of that discussion, though, Plato does have Socrates open the door a little bit, arguing that some kinds of art might be permissible, but it has to be the kind of art that, as with the literature over here, meets certain moral standards. And so if the censors for the city do make the judgment that the art meets those idealistic moral standards appropriately, then certain kinds of art can be allowed and so forth. But if we use Plato as representative here, art always has been viewed with a suspicious eye from the tradition of idealism. Philosophically, of course, this makes sense if we think it through. If we think of the metaphysics, art is a physically embodied mode of communication or a mode of expression, and the idealists are not interested in physical embodiments. And their argument is that in principle, the higher world, the spiritual world, or the non-physical world, however we characterize it, it is not something that is capable of physical embodiment, and so by definition, art as a physical embodiment is just out of consideration, metaphysically speaking. If we think also of the divide epistemologically, art appeals to us sensuously. It appeals to our eyes. It appeals to our ears. In the case of sculptures that are well made, we want to touch them. Music moves our bodies, right, as well as our souls and so forth. And so it is epistemologically appealing to the sensory side of our nature. It can have an intellectual component, and it can have an emotional kind of component as well, but the center of gravity, so to speak, is certainly on the sensory side of things. And again, for the idealist, there is a divide between the lower sensory order and the higher rational order or the higher spiritual order. So again, art is going to be fairly suspect. If we think about ethical issues, the artists have a reputation for being laws unto themselves, to wanting to create their own universes, to be godlike. We prize artistic creativity. We prize the artist as going against the grain and being innovative, right, and so forth. And one of the things that we know is true of idealist ethics is that it's very much emphasizing duty, obligation, in many cases tradition, top-down authority, and so all of those moral traits that seem to be part and parcel of being an artist seem to be morally suspect, and so we just don't want to open those cans of worms. Particularly in younger students, we don't want to have their art lessons be do your own thing creatively your own way, Johnny and Susie. Instead, we're trying to spend as much of time as we possibly can teaching them to be strict and obedient and to do their duty. Art lessons then seem to go against the grain. All right, so that's three curricular elements that I think would be rejected in mainstream idealism, mainstream principled idealism. It is true that there have been major compromises and evolutions within idealist traditions, particularly in the West as we've gotten further along into the modern world. But I think this is a good start on how to think through all of the various curricular elements from an idealist perspective. We could extend this exercise, and I'll leave this for homework or for independent thought here. How would we think about history, for example, if we were idealists? What would we say about foreign languages? Would we be interested in the teaching of economics being dealing with money and business, right, and so forth, go through the curriculum and make a decision, yes or no. Does it get on the idealist curriculum? Is it suspect and so to be excluded? Or is there more of a split decision? It could get on the curriculum, but it would have to be under certain circumstances. That's a fascinating exercise. I want to make one other point about the connection between idealist philosophy and educational practice, and that is involves an issue that we in the contemporary world wrestle with, just as teachers have wrestled with for centuries. And that is the issue of what we do in response to the fact that we have in our classes students of dramatically different abilities. We have some students whom we know seem to be off the charts intelligence, others who seem much slower and find it a struggle to get through the materials. Some students rather, who can concentrate on academic studies, and other students who seem, even though they may be bright, not at all disengaged with the material, and it's very hard for them to get through the material. So what I want to do is talk about that issue of tracking, which naturally comes up when we start talking about students of different ability levels from an idealist perspective, and make a connection to kind of mainstream idealist politics over the centuries. And here I want to use initially Plato as my working example, Plato being the most influential historically of all of the idealists. Now, I mentioned in Plato's Republic that he presents a full theory of philosophy with its implications for education, and all of that is in the service of trying to construct, at least on paper, an ideal political system from his particular perspective. And in his resulting political system, there's a direct connection to his views on human nature, and those views on human nature have very important implications for education for the right kind of a political system. It's true to say in the case of Plato that Plato is a dualist. He believes that the mind and the body are separable, in principle, stuffs. But then when you look at his theory of mind, he has a tripartite breakdown, that he sees the mind as having, so to speak, within it three constituencies of different focuses, different interests, and different ability level. So if we look within the mind, right, or the psyche, right, for Plato, he says there are really three things that are going on here. One, of course, is that we have various appetites. One thing that presents ourselves within our minds that is constantly going on is various desires, right, that we have for bodily things, right? We get hungry and we feel a certain kind of urge. That's not just a physical urge, it also has a psychological manifestation. We have a desire for food, we have desires that are sexual in orientation, and we have desires for say, destruction, for wrecking things. You know, think of a little kid who's just built or maybe his sister has just built a sandcastle at the beach. You know, the little boy who delights in coming along and jumping on it and destroying. So we have an appetite, say, for destruction in that particular case. Plato also says, I'm going to leave a gap here, that we have in our psyche, right, a capacity for reason, capacity for thinking abstractly, thinking in principle, thinking about longer-term consequences of various sorts of things and so forth. We also have a third aspect that I'm going to use this translation here, the spirited, right, element. And here Plato is thinking about our passions, right, or our emotions, but it's not simply our passions that are directed toward physicalistic, right, sorts of things. Here it might be our passion for glory, our passion for honor, or our ability to be courageous, and so forth. And that's not just, you know, a dry, intellectually desiccated experience. It's not something that is immediately tied to physical satisfaction. It is in that sense more abstracted, but it's a passion, and in many cases it has a values, right, component to it. All right, so Plato then has a tripart division of the psyche. We have these three aspects or three faculties, and they all exist in all human beings. But Plato says it's not the case that all three elements of the psyche are equally powerful, equally capable of being developed in all human beings. Instead, what we find is that in some people, this is the strongest and most dominant part of their psyche. In others, this is the dominant and most important part of their psyche. And in other people, and actually the vast majority of the population for Plato, this is the most dominant and important to them part of their psyche. And so Plato says there's really three different kinds of souls. You have what he called the iron-souled people. He uses a metal or a metallurgical analogy here. You have iron-souled people, and they are basically a whole lot of appetites. They might get spirited and worked up about certain sorts of things, but they're kind of weak-minded. They don't have very much going on intellectually, right, so to speak. You will, at the other end of the spectrum, of course, have people who are smart as a whip. They can think through things. They're whizzes at math. They love doing philosophy. And they find that it comes naturally to them, and correspondingly their physical appetites or their interest in those sorts of things are much diminished, and they're of course going to be passionate, but the kinds of things that they're passionate of are going to be intellectual kinds of matters. And then you're going to have other kinds of people who are not appetitive in this particular sense, and they're not particularly going to be the top students in your class and go on to graduate school and so forth, but they do have a lot of passion. They do like adventure. They do like glory. They're always ready to go out there and mix it up, and they're interested in experiencing the big wide world and so forth. All right. These are the iron-souled people, these are the silver-souled people then, and these are the gold-souled people. Now, the labels, of course, give away that Plato thinks these are the best, these are the second best, and these are the third best. But nonetheless, what we have in the case of Plato is a theory about human nature that is nativistic. That is to say, people are born a certain way with the mixes of their souls preset, and it's not something that's really going to change significantly no matter what kind of acculturation that goes on or what the education we expose them to is. Instead, what should go on in the education process is that the teachers should be sensitive to this issue and be talent scouting or spotting what kind of student they're dealing with. Am I dealing with a student who's mostly iron, or am I dealing with a student who's mostly gold, or am I dealing with a student who is mostly spirited? Okay, this then leads into the issue of tracking. If, say, I take 100 students who are now 5 years old and they're all coming into my school system and I'm Plato, what do I do with them? Do I give them all of the same education? Do they all have the same curriculum? Do I teach them all the same pedagogical techniques? Or do I need to start breaking the students up into different groups with different curricula, going off in different directions, different pedagogical techniques, right, and so forth? And Plato comes down very strongly on the side of the latter. What we need to do, because of this issue of human nature, is make sure that we are tailoring the education to the kind of student who is important, that we're dealing with here, rather. And in part, it's a matter of a wise use of educational resources that are scarce. He says, for example, there are lots and lots of people who, no matter what, are never going to get calculus. Obviously, this is before calculus, but I'm going to use it as my example anyway. You're never going to get calculus through to these people here. They're never going to understand higher order metaphysics, so why bother wasting time on this absurd presupposition that all students can learn everything? Instead, we should recognize that they're never going to get it, and so we just take that off the curriculum for them. On the other hand, we do know that there are lots of students who can get to calculus fairly quickly. They can get to philosophy fairly quickly. We should not be sticking those students in a class with a bunch of people who are never going to get it and teach everybody the same curriculum. All that means is that these students are going to be retarded in their development. They're going to be slowed down. They're going to waste a whole lot of time. They're going to get a bad attitude about education. They will start tuning out, and all of their potential will be wasted. So what we should then do is have different curricula rather for different kinds of students here. Now, I want to make a politics connection. In the case of Plato's political philosophy, he has what I think of as an organic conception of what society should do. And crudely put, he says if we look at a society and we're trying to organize the polity, what needs to be done in order for a society to function well and efficiently. And as it happens, Plato identifies three functions. He says, obviously, one of the things that has to happen is there are all kinds of material goods that need to be manufactured. We need people to grow the food. We need people to make our clothes. We need people to build our houses. We need people to sweep the streets, right, and so forth. So there's all kinds of manual labor, including various kinds of crafts that need to be done. So that's one category, the manual labor or the physical work, essentially, that needs to be done. We also need people to perform police functions and military functions. After all, there are going to be lots of people in our society who aren't going to obey the rules. They're going to break the rules. There are going to be fights. There are going to be thefts. There are going to be murders and so forth. So we need certain kinds of people to perform police functions to keep the peace and to catch the bad guys and so forth. And we also need, in that same sort of category, people who are able to defend us against, say, the city down the road or the people across the sea who every once in a while are going to come in and attack us and try to take us over. So we do need military-oriented people. But Plato says if you look at people who are doing police functions and people who are doing military functions, it's essentially the same sorts of things. These are more martially oriented types of people. And then finally, of course, we're going to need leadership. We need people to make the laws. Hopefully they will make wise laws. They will make just laws. People who can see the big picture, who can think long range, and so forth. All right, so we have then three social functions that need to be performed in a well-ordered society, and so I'll write those down here. We have social functions. Right. We need people to do various sorts of physical work. People to be the farmers, the carters to get the produce to market, the carpenters, and so forth. We need people to do the more martial types of operations, the police and people who are going to be soldiers in the military and so forth. And then we need people who are going to perform various sorts of leadership roles. People who will be our judges in the courts, deciding foreign policy and domestic policy as well. All right, now if we lay it out this way, then Plato says this is a beautiful thing, right? This is an issue of politics, this is an issue of human nature, and reality is working in threes. There's a perfect fit here. It makes sense then to say people who are by nature more appetitive, they're more physically oriented people. They're satisfied with spending time with their families, going to jobs, standing behind an ox all day while they're plowing the fields, bringing in the harvest, right, and so forth, having some wine at the end of the day while they relax. It makes sense that people who are dominated by their appetites, that they will be satisfied and fulfilled and otherwise most suited for being farmers, being carters, being carpenters, right, and so forth. Those things involve some spirit and some reason, but we're not going to overly tax people by training them to be farmers and so forth. The kind of people who are necessary for being police and soldiers, well, these are the kind of people who are very spirited. They're very interested in honor and glory and courage. They want to get out and see the world. They would be bored to death just standing behind a plow all day. But as it happens, there is a social function that we can very happily assign to them. They're the kinds of people who will make the best martial representatives of our society and perform those functions as well. Now, people who are spirited, if they're going to be in these roles here, they have to have a more developed reason. The police have to have a decent sense of justice. Soldiers, we want them to have a sense of strategy, and all of those require more development of reason than, say, being a farmer or a carter. And of course, these people also have their appetites, but the center of their being really is here, and these kinds of functions can satisfy them and our social needs as well. Then finally, what we want in our leaders is people who are highly intelligent, highly moral, and who are developed as extremely as possible in those cases, so that we can have the wisest policies put in place. And because we're giving these people a significant amount of power, they have the rational character as well. They understand the importance of justice, and they really know what justice is, so to some extent they can be trusted with that power. Now again, they are going to have some appetite appetites, but they're not going to be people who are dominated by their appetites. They're not going to let their appetites get the better of their reason. They are people who are going to be spirited, but again, if there's a conflict between their passions and their reason, because their reason dominates, they're not going to give into any sort of short-run passion. Instead, they will do the right thing in the wrong run. All right, so then, what we then are trying to do in society is take people, right, who are born with three different assortments of these psychological capacities here, put them through the educational process, and what we need is people come out who are able to perform what turns out to be three different kinds of social functions here. So Plato then goes on to conclude, it makes sense that we would have one kind of education that is appropriate for the physical, the people who are going to end up doing more physical work, another kind of education that's more appropriate for people who are going to end up in this line of work, and another kind of education that's appropriate for people who are in this kind of work. Now, chances are very good at the start of the beginning process we're not going to know which students are going to fall into which category, so we might take them all in as a group and everybody has pretty much the same curriculum, but what we're looking for is signs very early on that this student really is going to go off in this direction, this student really is this kind of a kid, and so he's more likely to go off in that direction. And so as soon as the teachers are in a position to make a good judgment, we start sorting the students out into those different categories, and we start then customizing the educational process in those different categories. Until chances are very good by the time we get to high school, it may very well be the case that these students don't have high school. They have been put into apprenticeship programs after they've learned their letters, after they've learned basic numeracy and so forth. These students would be off to police academy or off into military training, and these guys would be the ones who would go on into higher education and study diplomacy, politics, philosophy, higher order mathematics, and all of the more abstracted subjects as well. All right, now that's a quick and dirty version of Plato's account, but the point here is that we're connecting a view of human nature philosophically with a certain political philosophy, and again, the philosophy positions that we take have huge implications for educational practice. In this case, the educational practice that we're concerned with is tracking, and tracking is one of those perennial issues in the education world, so understanding the importance of the philosophical arguments that lead people to take this position on tracking as opposed to that position is absolutely important as well. We might make a mention quickly historically, in historical context too, if we think about the medieval world. The dominant structure of the medieval world also fell into a threefold category. We had three groups of people. We had the aristocrats, we had the clergy, and we had the peasantry. In the purest form of feudal society. And if you think about the aristocrats, the official job description of the aristocrats is to protect the realm. And so the aristocrats are the ones who started off as soldiers, and a big part of their training was initially in martial training. And so they were trained to do those kinds of functions. The leadership in many feudal societies, particularly Western feudal societies before the days of church and state separation, the theory and principle was that the church has supremacy over the secular order, and so the highest leaders, including the Pope especially, need to have a certain sort of educational process to be at the top of the social order, right, so to speak. Of course, there was in much of medieval times an ongoing tension between the aristocracy, right, and the clergy over which one had supremacy. But at least in theory, the clergy was supposed to be supreme. If we think of the standard ceremony when a king becomes king, the king kneels down before, say, the Pope, and it is the Pope who places the crown on the king's head. That's symbolic of the transfer of power, that it's the Pope who, as God's representative on earth, is the one who authorizes, sanctions, and legitimates the secular political power that the king is supposed to be exercising. And then finally, we have the broad mass of society, the peasantry, and we might here just throw in the guilds and the craftsmen and a few freeholder yeomen. But for the most part, their education is fairly simplistic, and it's focused on the physically oriented types of projects there. So again, in classical medieval society, classical feudal society, we again have a tripartite division that parallels Plato's almost perfectly. And we do also know that in feudal society, the education of the peasantry, the education of the aristocrats, and the education of the clergy was very different. And so in religious form, it ends up being the same thing as Plato's more secular form. What they have, though, in common is that they are both idealists philosophically. All right, we'll stop there.